Hello, everybody. How I wish everyone could I could say hello and everyone respond of all the attendees. But hello, welcome. I'm glad you could join us. My name is John Hornor Jacobs, and I'm excited to be your moderator at this event of the Six Bridges Book Festival. We have two amazing guests to speak with us today. Welcome to Linsey Miller and Daniel Kraus. We're all doing this remotely. Hi, guys.
Hi, thank you.
Folks. Between the two of both of our panelists, they have released 6 books in 2020, which is an outrageous amount of books to come out in a year. I'm going to introduce them. I want to start with Linsey. Linsey Miller is the author of The Mask of Shadows duology, comprised of The Mask of Shadows and Ruin of Stars. Ting Vogue called this pair of books uber bloody and action-packed, and best-selling author Tamara Pierce praised them outrageously, saying, "I love every aspect of this amazing book, a gender-fluid hero, a deadly contest, and a vicious courtly intrigue." 2020 also witnessed the release of 2 more books by Linsey, Belle Revolt, which I'm sort of embarrassed in that I had to ask how to pronounce, which is a Franco fantasy reminiscent of The Prince and the Pauper. And her second book is The Game, which is very different. It's a high school thriller involving a deadly game of pretend assassination that goes too far. Linsey is a former biologist from Arkansas. She returns, digitally at least, to grace us with her knowledge, skill, and talent. Thank you, Linsey.
Yeah, thank you so much.
And our other guest is, our next guest is Daniel Kraus, who has been to the Oscars. Daniel is the author of the award-winning YA novels, The Monster Variations, Scowler, and Rotters, and one of Entertainment Weekly's top 10 books, The Death and Life of Zebulon Finch. Daniel has also been part of some notable collaborations, 2 with Guillermo del Toro, with whom he wrote the novelization for The Shape of Water, the Oscar-winning movie of 2017, and Troll Hunters, which was the basis for the Netflix animated series. This year alone, he's released 4 books and begun a comic book series. The books are Blood Sugar, which is a bloody Halloween romp from Hard Case Crime Books. They Threw Us Away, which is a dark, illustrated middle grade story. Bent Heavens, a gritty sci-fi young adult novel. And The Living Dead, which is a collaboration with the estate of George Romero, completing the Night of the Dead Living Living Dead cycle. Sorry, that was a mouthful. His comic, The Autumnal, is perfect for the Halloween season, as is Blood Sugar. Patton Oswalt has called Daniel super creepy. He's called his comic super creepy. And now that we all know who we're dealing with, let's get started. This is normally when I would say, put your hands together, but we're not actually, you can do that separately in the comfort of your own homes. Am I still, did my shared screen come up at all during that time? Not at all?
Worked perfectly, I think.
Oh, it did? Oh, fantastic. Well, so I'm going to try to stop sharing it and get to the questions. Okay. So both of you guys released YA books this year, and as I was reading them, I was struck by some similarities. And we're going to get into that in a little bit, but what do you think makes for really engaging fiction for adolescents and young adults? And let's start with Linsey, if we could.
Even though Belle Revolt and The Game are very different, I mean, one's fantasy, one's thriller, and takes place in a fictional Arkansas town, I think they both share a same theme of the alienation you experience as a teen, no matter what level it's upon, and how you sort of have to grapple with that as you're growing up, and the sort of cliche of finding your place in the world, but you do have to do that, and sort of earning your place in the world, or discovering what you're worth or what you think you're worth, and fighting for your place. So I always think YA has to have some sort of similar journey of maybe if not discovering yourself, but discovering your self-worth.
Yeah, that's not bad. I think that I mean, I think even if you were super popular or something like that, and had excuse me, oodles of friends, you're still going to have some kind of alienation. Like and I think that comes with just figuring out who you are. Like you're still going to be turning inward a lot and figuring out, is this group that's around me who I want to be, and is it reflective of who I am in some sort of way? So I think those are good answers. I think subject wise, there's certainly nothing that I've been afraid to touch, but I think there are just some, common sense things. You're probably not going to write a book about a middle-aged tax collector or something. I mean, there are certain things that just aren't gonna fly plot wise. And I think the most integral component, and this is kind of like stating the obvious, but you have to have a young character. That is, as far as just like commercially and marketing wise, there are some YA books that I've written that there's almost no difference from the adult stuff they write. The only thing that's different is that the character is younger, and so you could make a case for it being for a young adult audience.
Well, both those answers make perfect sense. I'm lucky. I've read both of your books together, like at the same time. So I kept seeing so many similarities between the two of them. Both of your protagonists embark on these personal sort of journeys that get dark. I mean, they get pretty dark, and in particular, I'm talking about The Game and Bent Heavens, and they at first they engage in the sort of dark plot devices, and both of them at some point through circumstance, plot, development, they kind of sort of put on the brakes. Dana, you sort of touched on this, but can you go too hard in YA? Can you go are there things you won't touch when it comes to subject matter?
No, I don't think so. I mean, that's a personal choice, really, per author, what they feel comfortable with. But the stuff that I reacted to in ways that were either positively or constructively as a kid were stuff that was too far. I wasn't necessarily reading young adult books, which was a sort of different thing back then. But I was, as a young adult, reading adult things that would have surely been considered too much for a sixth grader or whatever age I was at the time. And that stuff affected me, I think, tremendously well. And if it hadn't, I would have stopped reading it. I would have just closed the book and stopped reading it. But instead, it helped me kind of figure out my boundaries, which ended up being extremely liberal, but it could have ended up being anything, you sort of like, you read books and you watch movies and you figure out what you're comfortable with. So the short answer is no. There's nowhere I wouldn't go. I think that I tend to write books that are about violence in some ways. And that's, again, to speak sort of on the commercial side of it, that's fortunate for me, because as a society, we don't seem to care as much about that. If I were writing about edgier books about sex, they'd come out of the woodwork. But because I'm dealing mostly with themes of, I'm being generalizing here, but violence, it's not been too much of an issue. And I can certainly say this, 100% of the people who have ever complained about the content in my books have been the adults. I've never, ever gotten any feedback from a teen or younger saying that this was too much. It's never going to happen.
Right. Linsey,
Yeah,
what about you? I mean, go ahead.
Sorry.
No.
Oh, no, I was just going to say I largely agree. I write a lot about trauma and violence because I think even though those are not always necessarily things we would like, young adults to read. They are things that happen often to young adults, and so it's unfair to sort of shield away from it. I mean, I know things that I'll never broach in young adult just because personally I don't think I could pull it off in a way that would be worth doing it. It'd be more hurtful than useful, I think. But at the same time, I still think it's something integral to a lot of things, because real life maybe doesn't involve all of the hyperviolence that we have in a lot of books, but it does involve something, and that's a period where a bunch of kids are deciding their own morality or facing their own mortality because suddenly they're leaving home and they're coming to the fact like, oh, I'm not invincible anymore. What does this mean for me? Or, oh, my actions have consequences. How do I grapple with that? But I mean, I know on like a fun aside, in my first book, I think beheading was something I wasn't allowed to describe on the page because that was a bit too gruesome. But to be fair, I had like a whole chapter about how hard it is to dismember someone, which probably a bit too far. But yeah, Belle has a bunch of medical related gore in it. And I find that on the page gore usually gets some pushback, but at the same time, that sort of sense of creeping horror you get when you're thinking about the things that I hope you think about when you read the things I'm writing about is something that I think we have to face in real life, and I don't want to shy away from it when I'm writing.
You know, when I was reading Belle Revolt, it's such an elegant book. Like the writing is so elegant, and so those scenes of when you're describing like it sort of sneaks up on you. It was so well done. I really enjoyed it. I have sort of saved that book for later, some later questions, but I do want to ask a couple. No, it's okay. No, not at all. No. I do want to ask a couple other things. So in the game and in Bent Heavens, like social media is like a big factor in the plots of both of those books to a certain degree. You know how cell phones have changed the way people write screenplays, right? Like, I mean, it's often a discussion. You know, how has social media changed the way you guys sort of construct narrative and plot nowadays? I'm just curious I mean, both of you had that as a big component in the game in Bent Heaven, and and while I was reading, and I was just struck by how similar, like there's so many confluent things going on between those two books. Go ahead and Linsey, you go ahead and start, and we'll jump over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing, and the one you hear most often, is why didn't they just call someone now? Because that's an option, and that definitely wasn't an option when I grew up reading a bunch of adult crime fiction and mystery novels, because that was what my library nearby mostly stocked. And that's not an option in those because you had a landline, so you couldn't just carry that around with you. And I don't know, just when I started writing the game, I just remember thinking, oh, I didn't have a phone in high school. That wasn't allowed. I think I got in-school suspension for having a CD player on me. I was just like, so I had to sort of sit down and be like, what does it look like now? And being able to communicate directly, because that sort of has the potential to remove a bunch of tension from themes or the whole book of just knowing that people are always sort of a step away from being able to communicate. But at the same time, there are so many ways to be able to disguise yourself when you're communicating across social media, whether you're disguising your email address or using a phone number or things like that. They just provide new avenues. So I just remember sitting down for a whole day and trying to think about how that affects everything, because it wasn't something I'd had to think about before, since I had only dealt with fantasy.
Daniel?
Yeah, I think that's well said. I mean, if you're writing something contemporary, I mean, it's not a decision. I mean, you have to include it. It's everywhere. So it's you just have to deal with it as you would deal with any piece of everyday reality. And Lindsay's right that, you know, it does take away some sort of classic like horror movie type tropes where you can't get to a phone, you got no choice but your cell signal is out. That's like your only move now.
Yeah.
But I think that's good. I mean, I think it's good to have new challenges, and there's a whole other element of tension. You may lose some tension in the fact that you can get in touch with people, but there's all this new tension that's constantly coming in now because of these gadgets that we're holding. Like, you're constantly being viewed by everyone, and I think there's a great potential there for stoking and growing paranoia and self-doubt. And there's a whole new audience that I think you can really feed off that. And it's almost like that stuff is all part of world and our nature now. You almost have to just focus on the real world and detach from all the movies and TV that we've seen. Like that's kind of the fantasy. That's the fantasy land now. The reality is we're connected in all sorts of dramatic and dangerous ways.
Well, I noticed that in both your books, at some point, something happened either on social media or through a phone that just ratcheted up the tension of both in both the game and in Bent Heavens. If it was like the protagonist discovering that like what's happening to one of her friends is being, you know, live streamed, or receiving emails or untraceable text messages. I mean, you guys did a great job using them. I thought it was fascinating. This is probably because I write a lot of historical fiction. I think that's probably one of the reasons I do, just to get it out of the way, so I don't have to deal with like modern, stuff. Anyway, so I'm going to get a little bit. I'm going to switch gears. Then this gets a little. A little bit more delicate. Walt Whitman said, "I'm large, I contain multitudes." So both of you guys, both of y'all do a great job of including diversity in your books. And this isn't like a test question. I've read both, your work, and I know you do a good job. I don't know really much about either of you personally, so I'm not trying to pry here. I just want to talk to you about, how do you guys write outside of your own lived experience in regards to diversity and inclusion?
I'll go first this time. Well, it's the same as it's always been for me. I mean, I'm a research fiend. I love research. I'll do it for months and months before getting started in research. I do it at a stage in which it can still affect the plot. So research tends to completely change the book that I thought I was going to write. And so, when whether you're dealing with, the details of some, long ago war, or just a different culture than yours, you gotta dig into it. You gotta figure it out. Experts help. You may not have anyone alive anymore who can tell you about the Battle of Manassas and the Civil War, but you do have people alive now who can tell you about this culture or that, and so you use them. You hopefully have friends and contacts you can reach out to and say, does this feel legit? Does this feel right?
So in The Living Dead, you're I was like, how does he know all this about the Navy? Like, I mean, like the whole aircraft carrier was so detailed and so realistic. It was amazing.
Yeah, I knew jack about the Navy. Yeah, that was an exceptionally difficult section. So yeah, that's it. I mean, you just treat it seriously. I think if you're a writer who is given to research, this stuff maybe feels a lot more natural. There are plenty of writers out there who just loathe research and kind of write contemporary books just based on what they know. And I think this kind of thing maybe seem more onerous to them, but they're going to have to deal with it and do it anyway.
Yeah, I again largely agree. I think there's a lot of value in recognizing when maybe if you shouldn't write it, there's no possible way it is within your wheelhouse or good for you to write it. And I mean, my stance on it has changed over the last, I think, 5 years even. Just like my own feelings on what I've written and published have changed over the last few years since Mask of Shadows came out, and then Belle. I sort of took different approaches to certain things because I was trying to figure out what I should be writing and how I should be writing it, but within the wider context of how publishing functions at that time. So I don't really know if I can go into all of it without just linking to 5,000 different people talking and saying much smarter things than I could ever say for several hours. But I don't know, like research, talk to people, recognize that maybe even if you do all of it, you just maybe shouldn't, because maybe it'll still ring hollow, or maybe it's not going to be what the readers need at that time, even if it's what you want to write about. So I don't know, or at least I try to take a very hard line of I'm writing for young adults. I remember what would have hurt me if I had read it as a young adult, and try to just make sure everything I write and all the characters I write are more help than harm.
My last book, I had a couple of sensitivity readers. Have either of you guys had sensitivity readers?
Yes, loads, and I love them.
Yeah. It's kind of like insurance. I mean, this sounds very mercenary. It's kind of like insurance. It just makes me feel more reassured at release that I haven't made some sort of myopic mistake from being a cis het white dude.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, like, even when it's something writing can be very singular and very focused. So you could just write something that if you were stepping back and reading it to yourself, you'd be like, that's not correct or good. So like I've even hired readers to just make sure that I'm not missing anything, even though it's something I should know all about, just because it's going to be out there for a while in the world, and maybe a lot of people read it.
Hopefully, that's the goal.
Yeah, hopefully a lot of people read it.
So you both of you have like huge range. Linsey, just in your last two books, you've gone from a French-inspired manor-driven secondary world fantasy to a teen high school thriller. Daniel, you went from like teen science fiction horror to historical fiction to children's books to comics. So, however the pendulum swings, what stays the same, if anything, in your work? Let's start with Linsey.
Oh, I hope it's themes. So I wouldn't want to say that definitively. I like to think it's the themes and just the characters staying and feeling real, no matter what world or time they're in, and feeling as though they're someone who is fully realized. But I like to also think that all of my books are sort of all in a singular series. It's just me figuring out the world and everyone figuring out like, oh, here are some good ideas. Let's carry on with that. Or here's what we want to do in the world. Let's go claim it. So I do know that something that stays the same in all of my books is that there's almost always an overly sarcastic side character or teacher. So I have that, if nothing else.
Well, I mean, plot-wise and structure-wise, I hope very little, but I know that's not true. Anytime I can recognize that feeling, and as writers, you know what I mean, like when you get into a certain part of your book. There's just something echoey about it. You're like, I've done this. I've pulled this trick before. So I want to squash those whenever I can and create new challenges with every book. Whether it's something in structure or in language or some sort of limitation. So I have to work around it and think in new ways. That's one of the reasons collaborations are interesting, because you're having to butt up against someone else.
I got a lot of questions about that for later, but
thematically, though, I think, having written 12 books at this point, certain things become undeniable, and I think something that's constant through almost all of my books is that I'm sort of setting the reader up quite often to see how far I can get them to sympathize with somebody who starts to do really bad things. So I will, I'll hook you and then kind of implicate you a little bit. And at some point, you're going to have to reckon with, why am I still rooting for this person? Has the protagonist gone too far to lose my sympathy? And I love that, because I love that in books that I read. I love putting readers and myself on the edge like that, and making them have to question the characters and themselves, and even the author. Like, can I trust this guy anymore? I like that tension a lot.
That's a great answer. I mean, and just because I'm gonna sort of ask questions just to satisfy me, like what I'd love to hear a little bit about you guys' process, just in the sense, I mean, I do a lot of research for my books because it's usually historical fiction, but are you plotters or pantsers or some sort of architects or gardeners? Or I'd love just a quick little I don't know, just a synopsis of your process, if you want to, just because I'm curious to see how you guys attack it.
Probably
Daniel,
my turn. My turn to go first.
Sure, and then
I am mostly an architect, partially because I've written some really long books. Some 600 or 800 page books. There's some degree of me that doesn't want to go down the wrong path for 400 pages and have to lose all that time. So I love research. I do months of research. I do sometimes months of outlining. I think, my outline for the Zebulon Finch books itself was 250 pages. And that's single spaced, thick pages. So my outlines can be novel length. So I go hardcore with the structuring, and counterintuitively, I find it really freeing, because when you're not thinking about what's the next, major plot point to hit, and of course things change, but generally when you're not thinking about that next big thing to hit, you can really just let go and write as beautifully and as abstractly and emotionally and strangely as you want, because there's something there that's going to pull you back a little bit, back onto the trail. Generally, I'm generalizing, but that's what I do. I do timelines upon timelines. I'm kind of a freak in that sense.
Yeah, you are. Hey, Linsey.
Sort of similar. I think you can see behind me the start of my Post-it note. So usually a lot of my ideas will sort of linger in my head for a while before I start writing any of them down, and I'll just take a bunch of notes. And this is the tame version of my Post-it note on my desk. And then I'll spend several days trying to perfect chapter 1, and then just dash through the rest of a draft after I have outlined it, so that I have it's just sort of what I call a trash draft of the bare bones of what I know I sort of want. And then after that, I'll sort of take the time to majorly outline the changes I want to make or what I want to make. And I am a big fan of rewriting. So I'll usually split screen, have the old draft on one side, and then just completely start copying and rewriting on the other side, so that I can do line edits while I do all the big changes. And I'll usually do that process a few times until I sort of hit the point where I'm reading the book and I'm like, yes, this is the feeling that I want. I've hit the mood that I want. I feel like every book sort of has a thesis, even though it's not necessarily a, here is my hypothesis idea, but it's a line that you can sort of distill your book down to. Once I feel like I've written that line in a draft, I'll stop rewriting completely and just sort of focus on edit. Or by that time, my editor will make me focus on edit.
That's fascinating. I hadn't thought about it, but it's probably why I'm all over the place. But like the whole sort of defining your thesis is a fantastic idea of like sort of to get to the thematic crux of your work. We actually have a question that dovetails with this nicely, so I'm going to go ahead and ask it. Victoria asks, "What is the worst writing advice you've ever received? The best?"
What's the worst writing advice and the best?
Yeah, so she says, what is the worst writing advice you've ever received? And what's the best?
Well, I mean, I think, if I may step in.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think the worst is, or was, something along the lines of, and I don't know, this may be a very unpopular answer, but never give up your dreams. I hate that advice. Like, I've seen people ruined by that advice. I think sometimes you have to know when to quit in the larger scale and the smaller scale, whether it's, I want to be the lead guitarist in a band. It ain't never going to happen. Or on a smaller scale, I'm working on a story, and at some point I have to reckon with when it's not going to work. I think knowing when to quit, it kind of sounds depressing, but it's actually, I think an advanced skill. It's like knowing it's not working is I guess the good version of the bad advice. And as far as the best advice, I don't have anything good for that. I would just say, the best advice the best advice I would give, and thus was probably had received at some point, was just to consume widely, read and watch things that are outside of your genre and outside of your comfort zone, and just constantly be looking to the far edges and the fringes, and it hugely enriches the stuff that I do anyway.
Yeah, I definitely agree on that best advice. My best advice personally, sort of tangentially to your worst advice, I think I talked a bunch about it in class 2 years ago, is just be okay with failing. Like you're going to fail at some point, and this is a career where failing is a necessity and will probably make you better 9 times out of 10. So just be comfortable with the idea of completely failing at what you're writing, because that'll help you get better. And sometimes, no matter how hard you try, you're going to fail at whatever part of publishing or writing you're at. And it is 100% okay. It's not the end of anything. It's just what's happening at that moment. And that was something I sort of clung to. My worst advice, I don't know. I think my worst advice, the advice that I always dislike, is sort of blanket statements of you should never, ever like write in such a way that it's not grammatically correct. It's like, I'm not gonna fall for that one, because there are just so many things that don't function as never ever do this. So I think because writing is such a personal experience, and you are writing for you or for readers, and everything's sort of subjective, any blanket advice is something that you should sort of sit with for a while before dedicating yourself to it. Like that, write every day, or don't write every day, or you'll never have writer's block. I think there are things that you can just sort of sit with and be like, okay, maybe sometime.
I totally agree. Yeah. I have real trouble like you know, there's kind of a cottage industry because it's hard to make a living as a writer. There's kind of a cottage industry among writers of teaching other people how to write because it's hard to make a living as a writer. So they're trying to figure out ways. And, you know, so there's a lot of people who are full of advice. And I have just real trouble giving advice because every process is so subjective. And I mean, it's personal. You know, you have to discover your process. I think that's a good amount on talking about our process. I want to talk some more about going a little bit differently in the sort of secondary world section the way I've been thinking of it. And for a couple of notes to the attendees of this meeting, feel free to type in any question you might have in the chat box. And just for the attendees also who are watching, secondary world is like a fantasy term that indicates a world wholly created in the author's sort of imagination and fleshed out that doesn't exist. It's not an alternate reality or anything. So I'm sort of loosely calling this the secondary world section because Bell Revolt is a secondary world, right? But The Living Dead isn't, but it is our extrapolated future based on, you know, the reality that of George Romero that he postulated, right? So I'm playing a little bit fast and loose with it, but so both those books depict worlds that are very similar to ours, but slightly different, or a lot different. Bell Revolt, a French-inspired fantasy, plays with the prince and pauper. The magic and social systems are elegant and clever. Linsey, will you tell us a little bit about the world building that went into that? I really love the idea of the midnight noonday arts, and I mean, it was so just, I don't know, its simplicity really appealed to me, but it's so elegant. Like it was just like, anyway, I'd love to hear about that. And then the next question will be more about sort of the collaboration with Daniel and the George Romero estate, because I think they're both sort of similar. It's the construction of a world. Go ahead, Linsey.
Of course, thank you so much for saying so. I think that's what everyone always wants to hear after they write something. I sort of knew the world I wanted because I had the characters first and the journey I wanted them to go on. And so I sort of tried to build a world that would facilitate that. And the magic system was completely different at the start and much more complicated, and changing it was correct. But I also knew I wanted it to be French inspired because part of what I thought connected it to contemporary political ideals was how similar its history and the current themes in there follow Reformation era France. So I took a history class in Reformation era France as part of my degree as my not an English class. But I also just read a lot, and I have binders and binders full of, if this doesn't happen, what does this mean? How does magic affect everything? And I usually always start when world building with does this society have germ theory? If so, what came before it? Because I think in fantasy, that's something that's really easy to overlook and just be like, oh, bad smells cause disease. And I like sort of diving into that because that changes how, especially in young adult fantasy, if it's a little more action-packed, your characters react to injuries or threats and things like that because they're much more deadly, or they're not. And so I always start with that, and especially with Bell, since I knew I wanted it to be partially medical in nature. I just spent a lot of time trying to figure out exactly how health interacted with the magic and how it would affect all the characters, and how being able to afford it would affect all the characters.
The device of having the school was like such a great way to get the information through to the readers without like info dumping or anything. It was just I was just very impressed with like I was taking notes. I was like, but it was just done flawlessly.
Yeah, thank you. I love school magic fantasy stories, and there was something sort of similar in Mask of Shadows, and I was just like, what if I just did it all out this time, and they're both at different schools, and I can introduce them to everything while they're at schools, because at the same time, I think that's a huge aspect of being a young adult.
Yeah.
You have to sit still for 8 hours a day and listen to people talk at you about things that you might not be interested in. But at the same time, these are two people who like very much want these moments. So they are very into things. And yeah, I liked giving them exactly what they wanted. The midnight art to the noonday art, I think, went through a bunch of different name changes, but were always sort of the same once we settled on that magic system. Because I wanted the magic system to do something very specific. And so I knew like what the metaphor I wanted with the magic system was. So I just sort of built out from there and then tried to make sure it all stuck together. And I don't know, one of the small things I like to do when world building in a secondary world is create idioms for the characters, different areas to have, because I think that's something we have a lot of in real life across the globe. And I think it makes sure that you understand what you're writing and also gives the readers hints at what the different characters are about and what they know and how everything sort of comes together, be it magic, medicine, or just the history of the world they're in.
Okay. Sorry, this is a little digression, but speaking of school, we both went to the same high school, Little Rock Central High. And so
did.
when I was reading the game, you would do or say some things that I would go, oh, now, like, and at one point you mentioned someone with the last name of Zook. Were you referencing Charles Zook?
I know Charles.
I was like, she had to know. I grew up two or three blocks away from Zook. I went to high school with him. I knew him way back. Anyway, that was just, I wanted to ask you that. And also, like, I don't remember what school I was in when we played Assassination, but I played that game. I mean,
I played it at Hendrick.
Yeah.
Okay. I was very bad at it.
I was never very good at it. I played it at Lyon College, so that was that must have been where it is. It wasn't at Central. Anyway, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I just when I was reading the books, I realized I had to ask you that question.
No worries.
I
love that people have caught on to it.
Next time I see Zook, I will tell him. Daniel, I'm going to switch over to The Living Dead. So in The Living Dead, you collaborated with the estate of George Romero. That's right? I mean, it was the estate. I mean, I know you've posted photos of yourself with George Romero, and I know you are a huge horror hound and everything. But, so in that book, you had to extrapolate far into the future of the world of the Night of the Living Dead. How much was there to work from Romero's notes? How much like of the sort of beatific ending? I love the ending, and it was such a high note. Like it was a perfect way to end it. How much of that was him? How much of that was you? And then what were the sort of challenges involved with finishing up his sort of life work? I know this is big question.
Big question.
So tell me everything. I was, I love zombies. I wrote a zombie novel, so I was like, I really want to hear about this book.
Yeah, I mean that's like an hour-long question, so I'm gonna try to really, and also I will turn my light on when this question's over because the sun has gone down. But anyway, so oh boy, how to encapsulate this? So yeah, it was the Living Dead was an epic George Romero novel that he left unfinished when he died, and then his estate, which basically means his wife and his manager, contacted me to finish it, and George Romero was my hero, my favorite artist in any medium. So, but if you want to talk specifically about kind of the secondary world building, George Romero directed Night of the Living Dead 1968, and then made Dawn of the Dead and Day of the Dead and 3 other zombie films, and was really the godfather of zombies, the creator of the modern concept of the zombie anyway. So there was a lot of material from George, and interestingly, it wasn't all confined or constrained to the opening. It was spread throughout. So there's a lot of stuff at the beginning, but there was some stuff that belonged at the very end, and there was other stuff that was kind of in the middle somewhere. So a lot of my job was connecting the dots and building bridges to all these things. And that gave me the bad side of that. It was extremely complicated. It would have been much easier if he had just stopped halfway through and I just picked it up. Instead, I was doing this sort of stitching together trick, which is difficult to make it fluid and feel like it's a united piece of work. But it gave me that push that I talked about earlier, that when you have a co-author or someone you're collaborating with, you want there to be a someone who's thinking differently than you. Otherwise, what's the point? Why are you collaborating? So having to come to connect back to these little dots that Romero had already put in place always got me back onto the Romero trail if I had somehow wandered off it, and ensure that he was present throughout the book. So that was good, and that felt important to me. So he had some of the end, including the very end, was in place by George, but there was a lot that wasn't. So the final act, which takes place 15 years into the future, and the furthest his movies ever got were about 5 years post zombie awakening. What I did then was, I did a ton of study into him and his films and his work and all this stuff that I could go on and about. But basically, to boil it down, we had these 6 zombie movies that he made. So I had points 1 through 6. And that if I studied them and could understand points 1 through 6, then I theorized that I could begin to understand what points 7, 8, 9, and 10 might be. You know, it was almost like a math equation. Let's play it out and see where we end up. So that's kind of where it went. That was the sort of opening step that I took. We had a lot from George Romero about the destruction of society. He gave us a lot of it, you know, in Dawn and Day and Land, especially. Those 3 movies showed the breakdown of society. So we had a lot of cautionary stuff from George Romero. This is how it's all going to fall apart. What we didn't have from him yet was how does it build back up? What happens when you game it out and you just look at the hard numbers of zombies and people and the ratios? There comes a point where the zombies are, you know, they're hundreds of thousands to 1 ratio. They aren't going to have anything else to feed on. There's not going to be any more zombies to be made because the very few people who are left have, you know, been able to, you know, fortify themselves and understand when someone dies, you have to kind of destroy the body. And so the zombies themselves begin to die. They begin to just rot to the point where they can't move anymore. So that's just logic. And once you start playing with that, you realize, okay, so we're going to have this new order yet again, where the zombies are a kind of elderly person. You know, they're an older state. And the people who are left now have an option, have a choice of, do we just now run over them, or do we try to be better than we were, the kind of people who got us into this mess to begin with? Do we somehow try to take care of these older zombies? But you know, like Lindsay was saying, and you were saying, you know, we make up idioms, you know. So basically what I had to do is I had to see what would a Romero, we know what a Romero dystopia looks like. What does a Romero utopia looks like? You know, what if you follow his logic and you follow his films, if we had to start all over again, and we do at near the end of this novel, what does that look like? How do we build a better world? And so that's what the final act of the book was all about, as far as formulating, you know, what does that better world look like? Who runs it? Who's involved with it? But it has everything. It has its own idioms. You know, people have in the future world, people have idioms for the different kinds of noises buildings make when they fall. Wooden buildings versus brick buildings versus metallic buildings. Then there's words for just idioms for just the crumbling of the world around us. I could go on and on. I won't.
Well, I wanted to say that third act, while it, you know, for a lot of like casual readers, it would seem like dissimilar from George's previous body of work. But I mean, it was so humanistic. I mean, like it was so, it was an elevation of like the values. Like, I mean, and it was, and just like classic Romero, it had a lot of social commentary. There was this demagogue. I'm like, all right, one, how does a society treat its its elderly? You know, that's a, you know, how does a society treat its most vulnerable? And so like when these sort of you know, you had that one zombie that was kind of like an oracle, you know, that they went to like confer with or sort of like commune with. And then, you know, you had that guy who was a demagogue, you know, while that sort of, I mean, very, you know, I hope there's no hardcore Trumpians in the attendees, but I mean, it was very much, you know, he almost ruined everything with his sort of demagoguery. I don't know. It seemed so essentially Romero to me, and I felt it was like I was kind of blown away by it. I thought like this is the perfect end to that sort of cycle of you know, and it was hopeful. Like I mean, while terrible things happen, and yeah, you know, it seemed. Well, I guess the thing is, it's a real trick that both you and Romero did to take a zombie story and end it on a hopeful note that's uplifting rather than sort of this not like the pat nihilistic sort of like everything, you know, we're all going to die, it's always going to be dead, it's all like sort of the Walking Dead type of value system. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean the trick of that is just to follow Romero's footsteps, and he was, you know, he was never making movies about zombies. The zombies were just the catalyst. So you just focus on the message. It's sort of like Linsey was saying, sometimes you think of the metaphor first and you build the world around that. You build the plot around that so that you can drive it home. And Romero was obviously, probably more than any, certainly horror filmmaker that we know of, he was a metaphor machine. I mean, he operated, zombies were entirely, every zombie movie used zombies as a metaphor in a different way. And this book should be no different in that sense.
Okay, so it's 6:23. I've got pages more questions. I way over prepared, but I do want to get in a couple more questions, and these are kind of just meatballs. Or anybody, if anyone in the any of the attendees would like to ask one, please just pipe in, and I'm sure our Nathan will tell us when it's all wrapping up. But okay, let's see. These are just fun ones. Like, so you've written for a lot of properties, Daniel, Linsey. If you could write for any IP that you haven't yet, who would you write for? Your dream IP, and let's start with Linsey.
Bloodborne.
What?
The video game Bloodborne.
Really?
Yes. I really enjoyed it. I really liked the type of horror and gameplay it had, and I would like to incorporate that in a book. So call me Bloodborne.
I want to play that, but unfortunately, I'm an Xbox person and I'm not a PlayStation person.
I played a friend's copy when we all lived together, trying to make our dreams come true, and I think I played it for 3 days straight. No, I'm just really taken with the whole idea of that. So yeah, that or Pitch Black.
Or Pitch Black? The Riddick Bowe.
Yeah, the Riddick Chronicles series.
I mean, hand it to them. They go weird places with that whole series. So I mean, it's interesting.
Went so many weird directions, and I was very into most of it.
That's very cool. I would love to see you write those things. Daniel, what about you?
My number one is happening. So I can't talk about that. So sorry, but
Can you tell us what it sounds like?
No.
Boars.
And my number two is something that I really hope will happen. So I'm not going to say that either because it's something I'm trying to make happen. But I do have a number three.
Okay.
I have a really, really screwed up idea that I would love to do with Archie comics. They would have to be like, they would have to really be feeling daring that day. But
you gotta holler at Alex Segura.
I know Alex. I think, I don't know. I can't imagine them ever going for this.
He's like in charge of the whole Archie Riverdale stuff. So
yeah.
I mean, he would be on that.
Yeah, I think Riverdale's gone in some weird directions. I think they might be into it.
Yeah, this is really, really pushing it. But I love the idea of taking something like Archie or something like the Hardy Boys or something, and then just like pushing it like so far into disturbing territory. So we'll see. Stay tuned.
All right. Well, cool. I'm excited to. I just wish I knew what they were. I'd like to hear more about it. Okay, so well, you've already nixed a couple things off the sort of discussion board, but so for both of you, let's start with Linsey. What are your plans for the future? What do you have in the pipeline? What's coming out?
Yeah, I have a book coming out in June or July of 2021, so next year. It's another standalone fantasy called What We Devour that I lovingly refer to as the sequel. If you take the ideas of my books, I feel like the end result of everything I've written about previously. It's about a young girl who gets caught up in the machinations of a bloodthirsty ruler, a door that the man flood sacrifices to keep demon-ish creatures at bay, and weird magic that I've somehow made weirder. And then after that, I have some other stuff coming that I also can't talk about. So goes the fun of publishing. But yeah, hopefully it'll be a fun next few years.
That's great. That sounds amazing. I also want to hear. I want this to be a private conversation, so you guys can tell me what you're working on. Okay, so I've got. I don't know. We're right at 6:30, 6:28. I think we should probably wrap it up. Though I have some more questions I could ask. Where can we find you guys? Where can we find your books? I think I did post your websites earlier, but where can we find you online? And we'll say goodbye. Go ahead, Linsey. Let's go with Linsey first, Dana.
Oh, okay. I'm on Twitter a lot. You can find me. I got my real name for nearly every social media site at linseymiller.com. I also do a twice monthly podcast where 4 other young adult authors and I, yes, 5 young adult authors play Dungeons and Dragons and generally roll very poorly. And you can listen to that. It's called Spell Check.